Continuing with our study in the book of Romans. In the last video, we had looked at Romans 1:18. Right now, I would like to continue with 1:19, but I would like to go back and read from 1:18. We're really in a section here that has some logical relation, or there's a kind of a chain of thought here, and we will pick it up in Romans 1:18, which says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men, who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened." And that'll be what I'll read right now for comment. God is angry. And in the last video in verse 18, we talked about some why he is angry. But in this verse, it clarifies the basis for God's anger. Again, at the beginning, in verse 1:16, I said in the gospel, and told about how some translations say a justice from God is revealed, and in other translations say the justice of God is revealed. And here's a place I think that Paul is really showing us the justice of God. He's explaining to us that God is just in judging us in this fashion. As he says, and what it says is, we saw in 18 that his wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness, godlessness and wickedness. Then in 19 he says why God is angry, and the basis for God's anger, or why he has a righteous anger, why there's correct and just in having anger. He says, since what may be known about God is plain to them. And one of the best commentaries I've had on this verse from another brother was the fact here he's not saying that they may be able to figure out what's true from God, but this is God's word, God speaking, and God says, you know what? It is plain to them. Men can act ignorant, men can act like they don't get the point, but God has set forth, and he's going to call every man to account based on the fact that what may be known about God is plain to them. And the reason it's plain to them is God has made it plain to them. God made the human mind, God made the human senses, and he's revealed himself in creation, as we can see, as we're going to see as this follows down. But what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Of course, one of the big truths in here is that you may know things about God. God is possible to know God. It's not an unknown God. It's not that we're incapable of knowing him. You can know God. And what may be known about God, again, what may be known is that we're not going to know everything about God, but there are things about God that can be known, and those things that can be known are made plain to them because God has made it plain to them. God has made, in other words, God has given knowledge about himself to every man. If you notice, is the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men. So all men everywhere that are godless and wicked, God is angry at them because all men everywhere, godless and wicked, God has made plain, since what may be known about God is plain to them. God has made it plain to all these men, things about God. And verse 20 goes on and explains us what things about God have been made plain. It says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities," and explains which qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So since the creation of the world, in creating the world, God put man in the world, but in that world he had created, you can see some invisible qualities of his, and it really mentions two invisible qualities. His eternal power and divine nature. His eternal power, what we might ask today, if this is just old-fashioned, if modern science has kind of obliterated this and it no longer relates. But think about the power, his eternal power. If we had gone back 100 years ago and some guys sitting around a campfire and we said, well, what power do we see there? We'd say, well, their hearts are beating and, they have a certain body temperature and there's the fire there that has some logs on it and those logs are burning and then there's power there or energy there. But now with the atomic age, we know that even the cold rocks that they were leaning back on are full of power, full of energy. With the atomic discovery of atomic power, there's a tremendous power. The whole universe is really filled with energy. The E equals mc squared. So when we see power, there's a great power, energy, translating or understanding power as energy here, all throughout the universe. And of course with astronomy and so forth, as we see these stars and how much they burn and so forth, we just see in the creation of the world, his eternal power. We understand that the power in the world is that's displayed is really beyond our comprehension, beyond our measure. And then we see his divine nature, or the fact that the intelligence of creation, the things that are done in creation. And again, for example, 50 some years ago or 60 some years ago, no one understood DNA. But now we understand that there's written in the DNA the exact plan. The human DNA, or possibly the DNA of a wildflower, may be the most sophisticated design document that exists in the universe. And we see God put that there. He put that there long before man knew about it. But of course, not only do we have the DNA, this is not a new thing. If we go back and look at the book of Job, we see God saying there, well, where were you when I did all this? And what about these animals and how they go? And how about the ecosystem and the water cycle and so on and so forth? So we see really a wisdom, a divine nature in all the things created. And so it says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible powers, his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. In other words, if a God came along and judged, if a God was mad, if his anger from heaven was being revealed against all men with wickedness and godlessness, and they didn't know that they were supposed to be any different, then they would have an excuse. But since it's been revealed that there is a God, when your godlessness then has no excuse. And this is basically what we're going to do here, and I want to go back and make sure we have the outline of this. In this case, kind of looking forward. But Paul, most evangelical Christians will quote Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. And that's really, for us to quote that to non-believers by itself, I think is really a cop-out. It's laziness. Because Paul's going to go through here and show 3 different areas where we are guilty and why we are sinners before God. And they all relate to God revealing himself. God reveals himself in a certain way, and we should respond in a certain way. When he reveals himself in a certain way and we don't respond, then we are guilty of sin for not responding in a correct way. And this kind of goes back on which have withheld the truth with unrighteousness, suppress the truth by their wickedness. Different translations on that, but the NIV, the suppress the truth. So he's revealed himself here. He can be clearly seen. So our godlessness, we have no excuse. We are without excuse. No man can go before God and say, oh, there's a God? I never realized that. The thought never occurred to me. Now maybe they have a mental fight with that and they don't philosophically accept it or whatever. But this verse is saying is that his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, so that men are without excuse. So this is the creator. This is the guy who's going to judge us. This is the guy who holds all of the world that he created in his hands. And he's saying, I have revealed myself. It is clear to you. You are without excuse. And I'm going to leave the next verse forward, but just the response. In the next verse, it says what kind of response we should have. And obviously, it's going to condemn us for not having that kind of response. But here we see what God has revealed about himself. And this puts us as no excuse before God for our godlessness and wickedness before God. we'll continue with this. Thank you for watching these videos, and pray that they'll be a blessing to you.